This webinar is being hosted by Surrey Virtual School. So as way of introduction, my name is Helen Hale. I'm one of the assistant heads here in the Surrey Virtual School. And our role is to promote the education of all of Surrey's looked after children and previously looked after children. So we support designated teachers in schools and earlier settings through the PEP process, so the personal education plan process. And also providing kind of support and training around aspects that might be facing our looked after and previously looked after children. So that's kind of an overview of the role of the virtual school. Specifically in today's webinar, we're going to be looking at the impact of trauma in the early years. So like I said, it's an introductory kind of overview webinar. There's a little bit of information at the end about where you can go for further information, and hopefully if it's useful to you, then we can look at putting on more events like this in the future. So the kind of objectives that we're going to be thinking about in today's webinar are reflecting on current research into how trauma in the early years impacts on brain development, considering how the effects of trauma impact on children's experiences and relationships in the early years, and consider practice implications and strategies that can support children in your settings. So I know we've got quite a wide range of roles and settings here with us today. I can see from the list of attendees that we've got some practitioners from schools, from nurseries, other earlier settings. We've got a couple of childminders joining us as well, and we've got some members of Surrey's early years team as well. So all very welcome, but all coming from slightly kind of different angles in the way that you might work with children. So hopefully we can kind of cover practice implications and strategies that are going to be suited to all of your roles and all of your different environments. So looking at early childhood trauma and what constitutes as early childhood trauma. So just a little quote here for you. So any situation or event that leaves a child feeling overwhelmed and alone needs to be considered as trauma. So what are we looking at? Most people, when they think about trauma or a traumatic event in childhood, are thinking about one of the situations in the left-hand column. So a big traumatic event that a child might go through, such as bereavement or serious illness, and that can be a parent, a sibling, serious illness themselves if they spent a lot of time in hospital, an accident, domestic violence or sexual abuse, neglect, homelessness, a parent who is substance dependent, parent with mental health difficulties, parental incarceration. So clearly all of these things are going to be really traumatic for children to experience in childhood. But there are other other situations that can have a similar traumatic effect. Might not necessarily be to the same scale, but it can still have a similar traumatic effect. And these are more of the small kind of ongoing situations that might occur. Now, the reason these can have a similar effect is due to really the stress response. And if these situations leave children in that stress response for an ongoing period of time, it can have a very similar effect on their body and their brain development as the larger traumatic effects. So some of the situations that I'm talking about could be a lack of an emotional connection, controlled crying, a difficult birth, multiple home moves, parents who are highly anxious or very harsh in their parenting, a family breakdown, and parents who themselves could be experiencing a trauma response. So it's more than likely that children who have experienced trauma may have experienced several of these things, and that the traumatic events may not happen in isolation, but they may actually be followed by some of these ongoing traumatic situations. So, for example, you know, if you have substance dependent parents, then it could lead to a lack of an emotional connection. Or highly anxious parents, if there are parents with mental health difficulty, for example, it could lead to highly anxious parenting. So oftentimes the traumatic event and the ongoing situation where children are left in that stress response can go hand in hand and really have quite a significant impact on that child's development. So what does it actually look like in terms of infant brain development, and how is it impacted? So when we're born, our brain is made up of neurons, which are connected by synapses. So to keep it simple, we're not here to do, you know, an in-depth look at neurology, but we just need to have a little bit of an understanding of what the brain looks like when we're born and how it develops over the first few years of life. So one neuron synapses with 10,000 other neurons. So you have the neurons and they make connections with lots and lots of others. And that's how our brain develops. So the infant brain has 100 billion neurons at birth. So it has all these neurons already. It just doesn't have the connections in place yet. There's a rapid period of growth in that first 12 months of life. So the brain weight increases from 400 grams at birth to a kilogram at 12 months. So it over doubles in weight. And that's due to those synapses being developed. And babies use 63% of their calories in brain development compared to 18.5% in adults. So our brains are developing all the time, and it does use, you know, some of our energy in that brain development activity. But for babies, it's a hugely significant portion of their energy that goes into their brain development. So what are neural pathways? That's what we really want to look at. So these are the pathways between the neurons. So most neural pathways are not in place at birth, apart from our primitive reflexes. So thinking about breathing, coughing, those kinds of things. So the reflexes that cause those things to happen are of course in place, but most neural pathways are not. So what happens when we have incoming stimuli through our senses? They activate those synapses between the neurons, and as they're activated, they become stronger and stronger, and they create that neural pathway. If there are pathways between neurons that are not regularly used, they're pruned away so they don't become strong. And it's input from all of our senses that leads to this network being established. So babies taking in things, you know, through their sight, through their hearing, through their touch, taste, smell, all creating this network in our brains. Okay. So the important thing to remember about brain development in the early years is there's two key areas that kind of develop through different situations. So you've got your frontal cortex, which is this part at the front of the brain, which is labelled logic in the picture, because this part of the brain is responsible for our logic, rational thought, cognitive processing, language production, problem solving, all those kinds of logical thinking things. And this part of the brain is developed by positive social interactions. So when babies and children have lots of positivity, lots of reliable caregiving from the person that's caring for them, the synapses between the neurons in this part of the brain fire again and again and again. And as they do that, those links become stronger and stronger, and this part of the brain becomes really, really well developed. And those children will develop those skills, you know, the rational thinking skills, the problem solving skills, the complex language production skills that will enable them to really kind of thrive in childhood and in life. The other part of the brain that's significant to think about is the limbic system. I always forget the name of it for some reason, but it's the part in the picture that's labelled emotion. So this really is our emotional control deep within the brain. Now, this part of the brain develops and gets stronger when we experience negative social interactions, harsh parenting, violence, shouting, or neglect. So if our needs are not met by a caregiver, that causes the synapses between the neurons in this part of the brain to fire again and again and get stronger and stronger. Now, this part of the brain is kind of known as our fight or flight response. So you might have heard that term before, where we kind of come across a difficult situation and we either kind of fight it or we take flight, we run away because we don't know how to deal with it, not able to deal with it in a kind of rational, logical, problem-solving way. So for those children who experience those negative early interactions or neglect, so an absence of them, this part of the brain gets really, really strong. And in kind of comparison, the kind of frontal cortex, the logical part of the brain, doesn't get strong because those neurons, those synapses are not firing, so they're pruned away. So they actually don't develop those kind of problem solving skills, and instead they're going to rely on that emotion side of the brain to make the decisions for them, which can be kind of snap decisions, fight or flight, and not necessarily always thought through. So that's how the kind of earliest interactions and how responsive our caregivers are can really impact the physiological development of the brain and cause one area to be particularly stronger than another. So we can see that here from this image, which shows a healthy brain against a brain that has experienced severe neglect. So what you can see is that frontal region that was labelled in the previous picture as the kind of logical rational region. You can see in the healthy brain that that's large and it's red, so it's showing up clearly in the scan as well developed. And in the neglected brain, you can't see anything in that area at all, so that area has effectively been pruned away and not developed effectively. So how does that impact young children when they're kind of learning different skills in the early years? So there's an approach which has been shared over the last kind of 20 years, really. It's quite well known, and that's around sensitive periods. So the suggestion that children at different stages of their kind of early years in childhood are particularly sensitive to learning different skills. So I know this graph can look a little bit of a mess, but we'll kind of work our way through it. And some colleagues within the early years team will know this very, very well. So hopefully it will be a nice little reminder. But the different colours are reflecting different skills that, we expect young children to learn. And we've got the years along the bottom. So we're going to be particularly focusing kind of on the first 5 years of life in the early years. So it's quite interesting, kind of a couple of them that are quite interesting to note. You can look at vision, which is the white line. That's quite easy to spot. You can see that, from birth, really, from the 0 point on this graph, children are very sensitive to everything they see coming through their vision, and this continues to be the case and gradually drops off when they get to around 4. Obviously, they're still seeing lots of different things after this point, but they have undergone the kind of drastic brain development that comes from what they see and what comes in through their eyes. You've got language production, which is this kind of yellow line here. So initially the sensitivity to language is about halfway. It's not super high. It gradually gets higher and higher over the first year of life until it kind of reaches its peak, and then it stays extremely high from kind of 1 to 4 years old, when children are learning all that language, taking in all the language they're hearing around them, and kind of replicating it and producing it. So the one that for this webinar we're particularly interested in is emotional control, so this pink line. So how children develop their emotional control. And what this graph is suggesting, that in the first 3 years of life, really, children are, really, really sensitive to developing that emotional control. So this is when they learn how to recognise their emotions, moderate their emotions, control their behaviours in response to their emotions. So what this theory is suggesting is that if children don't learn these particular skills during this sensitive period, it's not necessarily that they can never ever learn them, but it's going to be really, really challenging for them, much more challenging than if they learnt them during the sensitive periods. During the sensitive period, if they have stimuli, it should be quite straightforward for them to learn. Most children, the majority of children, will learn language during this sensitive period, as long as they're in a language-rich environment and they've got the skills to be able to do that. The same with emotional control. We have the infamous toddler tantrums around 2 years old and things, where children are testing their boundaries, but most children, given good enough parenting, will learn that emotional control, will learn to kind of recognise and manage their emotions through kind of modelling the adults in their lives. If they don't learn to do that during this time, it can be extremely difficult. So, some examples of this for the other areas. There are examples of children who have sadly lived in kind of orphanages for first few years of their life and have not been exposed to a rich language environment, and some of them have gone on either not able to learn much language at all, or able to learn it, but it's been extremely challenging for those working with them and those teaching them, and will remain a lifelong challenge for them. And the same can be said for emotional control. So if those skills of kind of moderating their emotions and learning to manage them are not learned in those first really 3 years where the sensitivity is really high for that skill, it's not to say they can never learn to manage their own emotions, but it's going to be far, far more difficult for them. They don't have those kind of really well developed skills that other children may have developed in those first 3 years. And it could be a real challenge and will take a lot of hard work of those kind of teachers and professionals working with them. So if you couple that alongside, you know, the physiological aspect that their brain may look different and may work different, and you know, you can really start to see how difficult it can be for children who have not developed that level of emotion control in the early years due to parenting or experiences they, you know, traumatic experiences they might have undergone in those early years. Haven't got any questions at this point, have we, Abby? Listening out.
No, we haven't yet, Helen.
No. Okay, if anybody has any questions, please stop me or please pop them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them as we go along. It's so strange not being able to see you all and not being able to kind of gauge whether, you know, this is making any sense or whether I'm just chatting away. But hopefully it's making sense. And if you do have any questions, please do pop them in the chat and make them known, and we'll do our best to answer them. All right. So moving on to look at the impact of social interaction. So we've talked about the brain and what that looks like. So positive social interactions causes those neural pathways in the prefrontal cortex to strengthen. That's going to give children the best kind of biological starting place. So they've got a really well developed frontal cortex that has those skills and those abilities to problem solve and think things through rationally. So that's going to give children the best kind of chance, really, in terms of biology. Another impact of positive social interaction is reducing stress in children, and we're going to look as we go through about why stress in children is so important. And it also provides fabulous opportunities for learning. Obviously, a lot of learning that takes place, it is through modelling, and where children experience positive social interactions, they can model those and feel safe and secure enough to learn. So another quote for you here. So the effective regulation of brain growth relies on attachment relationships. So we're going to be looking a little bit into attachment and why that's so important, and why lack of that can be really damaging to children, and you know, not necessarily be one of those hugely traumatic events that we looked at in the very first slide, but actually could be an ongoing traumatic situation or cause of stress for a child if they've not got that really strong attachment to a reliable caregiver. So I'm sure all of you working within early years, you have some experience of looking at attachment theory, and we're not going to go into it in huge depth today. You know, it's not an attachment focused webinar, but it is really relevant to the work we're looking at with trauma and the effect on children in the early years and how that looks. So we're just going to have a little bit of an overview of attachment, so hopefully be a bit of a refresher for most of you. So just got a picture of John Bowlby up here if you haven't seen what he looks like before. He is the kind of founding father of the attachment theory. And he said that the infant is biologically programmed to seek physical and emotional proximity of an emotional available caregiver who will sensitively respond to their expressed needs and provide them with a secure base from which they can explore and understand their world. So the most important part of that, in my mind, is the emotionally available caregiver. So it's not just that physical element of care. It's not just feeding the child, keeping the child clean, you know, keeping them sheltered, those kinds of physical aspects, but it's really the caregiver being emotionally available and attuned to the child's needs, able to recognise those needs and able to comfort the child and therefore reduce the levels of stress that the child experiences. So attachment begins at birth. So research has shown that newborns can discriminate between the smells and sounds of their own mother from other women. Mutual gaze is hugely important. So babies can distinguish between a smiling face and a face showing surprise. And the mother's response gives baby a sense of constancy and reliability.
Yeah.
So you can see an example of this if any of you have seen the still face experiment. So if you've done attachment training in the past, you may have come across the still face experiment. I'm not going to show it today because so many people have seen it before. But if you haven't seen it, just go onto YouTube and search still face experiment and it will pop up. And essentially it shows a baby around a 1-year-old baby interacting with their mother, and the mother has a very smiley face and is very responsive, and the baby's very engaged. And then suddenly the mum turns around, and when she turns back to the baby, she has a completely still face. And it takes, you know, a matter of seconds before the baby starts to panic and starts to kind of show signs of being quite distressed that the mother is no longer showing these kind of positive facial expressions, positive interactions. And so the baby finds it, you know, instantly unsettling and instantly distressing. And that is a baby who, you know, is purely being used for the experiment, otherwise has a very secure attachment, but very quickly senses that change in her mother. And don't worry, the mother very quickly smiles again, and all is resolved. But you can imagine if that is the experience of a child ongoing, how damaging that could be. So just as an overview, what do securely attached children look like or experience versus those who are insecurely attached? Securely attached children have a sense of themselves as loved, autonomous and competent. They see other people as available, cooperative and dependable. They're able to approach their carers directly and positively with the expectation that their distress and upset will be recognised and responded to unconditionally with comfort and understanding. So that is the experience they've always had. This leads to children who are more confident, flexible and able to empathise, and they're able to regulate their own emotional state, which will be more and more important as we look at this. Insecurely attached children, however, are going to experience a higher risk of externalising their problems, so not being able to manage them themselves and having to seek support of the outside world. And their behaviour is often characterised by aggression, defiance or hyperactivity. Their language development is often slower. They have weaker executive functioning, so that ties in with the kind of problem-solving, rational element of their functioning. And they tend to be less resilient to poverty, family instability and parental stress and depression later in life. So really long lasting effects. There are a few different types of insecure attachment. If you know a lot about attachment, you'll know the different types. There's avoidant, ambivalent, and disorganized attachment. They're slightly different in the way they come about through different types of parenting, and they present slightly differently in the way that the child responds to the caregiver. For example, whether they seek them out or whether they push them away or whether they avoid them entirely. But for the purposes of what we're looking at today, the important thing is that, you know, if children don't have this secure attachment figure with their main caregiver as an infant, they're going to find it much harder to make good, strong relationships, you know, later in life when it comes to staff in an earlier setting, when it comes to teachers in school, when it comes to friends, relationships later in life as they get older. All of these type of relationships are going to be more challenging for children who haven't got that secure attachment with their primary caregiver. Okay, so that's all I'm going to really say about attachment, but it's worth bearing in mind. More often than not, children who have experienced trauma in their past, many of the reasons we looked at the very beginning about what type of trauma a child might have experienced could potentially go hand in hand with not having a secure attachment. And we're going to look at what types of things children might experience and what they can be buffered by, and one of the things they could be buffered by is having a secure attachment figure. So even if children may have experienced, you know, some significant trauma in their early years, the effects of that will be kind of dampened and lessened if they have a secure attachment figure. So for those children who have experienced that type of trauma and haven't had that secure attachment figure, it's going to be all the more challenging for them. Okay, so we're going to move on to look at the stress response in children and what stress can do to children. So when we talk about stress, we're talking about a hormonal reaction in the body. So we're talking about cortisol. So there's two hormones on this graph. Adrenaline, which is initially released by the body when there's an event, a stressor, something of concern, something of note, something that we notice, we release adrenaline. If this turns into a kind of stress response, something that causes us to be, you know, under anxiety or under distress, then we release cortisol, and cortisol is that stress hormone. Now, everyone experiences stress in their life, and lots of stress can be healthy. So when children face a slight problem that causes some stress and then they resolve that, that can be, you know, really useful for them in terms of learning, problem solving, things like trial and error. So there is, you know, a need for stress in growth, in development, and that's absolutely fine. And we call this healthy stress. And this is what it looks like in terms of the adrenaline production and then the cortisol production. So low levels of cortisol are not going to be damaging to the body. They're actually going to be useful because that's how we learn to problem solve. So that's what we would see, you know, fairly often throughout childhood as children make mistakes or get things wrong and then fix their errors and learn. Now that's compared to this, which we call toxic stress. So if children are placed under this level of stress again and again and again and again and again consistently, then they're going to have lots of spikes of adrenaline. And importantly, the cortisol is going to remain at that heightened level. So I'll just flick back so you can see cortisol starts right at the bottom and it goes right back down to the bottom again when there's healthy stress response. In this one, it never goes back down. So although the adrenaline spikes up and down, up and down, up and down as different events happen, the cortisol remains high throughout. And this is what's really dangerous for children. That permanent, ongoing, heightened level of cortisol can be really, really damaging. And this is what we refer to as toxic stress. We're going to have a look at the impact of that. So there are lots of detrimental effects of cortisol, and that's what we're going to move on to look at now. I was just making sure I hadn't missed anything in my notes. Okay, so what are the effects of this stress on children? As you can see, as you can imagine, as you can see, there are lots of them, and they kind of fall into different categories. So starting from a kind of physical perspective, I mean, you'll all know from yourselves when you're under periods of intense stress, the kind of effect it has on your body and on your mind, on your mood. It's all similar things in children. They're just going to present in different ways, and children will not have the skills that we as adults might have to manage them. So the physical effects of stress in children could be more infections, lead to heart disease, obesity, slower healing, growth problems, skin diseases, so like eczema and rashes and things, asthma, insomnia, so problems sleeping. So all of these physical effects can be seen in children who are under kind of extreme stress. The emotional side, so you might see children experiencing depression, really low energy, personality traits such as violence or disobedience. You might see symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Psychological, so it goes kind of hand in hand with emotion, but more kind of mood related. So you might see irritability or aggressiveness, frustration, guilt, confusion, isolation, anxiety. Socially, you might see children who are withdrawn or lack motivation. They might struggle in setting or in school and have difficulty paying attention. And behaviourally, you know, you might see overactivity, disobedience, regression to kind of behaviours they might have displayed as a younger baby, a younger child, changes in their eating habits, they might be more accident prone and cry more often. So it can be difficult kind of looking at that list. It seems huge, and some of them, you know, you'd be concerned even if you saw just the kind of one effect. But really, for children who have been under that kind of toxic stress response for a great deal of their early years, they're probably going to be showing quite a few of these things. You know, lots of them go hand in hand, and that's when, you know, we'd be really quite worried about the impact on the child. And the way that they would be able to function in an early years setting or in a classroom would be, you know, obviously extremely limited if they're showing some of these effects. Okay. Yeah. All right, so those are the kinds of things you might see in the short term as children are children and are you know, in the earlier setting or in the classroom. But there's also a really, you know, significant long-term impact of this kind of trauma and stress in the early years. I don't know how many people have heard of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit today. It was basically a large study that was done to look at adults who had experienced some of these things in their childhood and what the impact was on their and different areas of their lives. So they looked, you know, longitudinally across individuals' lifespans to look back at the experiences they had as a child and to link those to some of their outcomes as an adult. I'll talk a little bit in more detail about it. I'm also going to add a video in that tells you more about it, and then there's further reading you can do if you're really interested in it. So there are 10 adverse childhood experiences that this particular study looked at, and these things were kind of categorized as traumatic or stressful experiences during childhood. So they class that as before a child's 18th birthday. Specifically today we're looking at the impact of things that happen in the early years, so you know, really happen to a child when they're really young. This is looking at what's happened throughout a person's childhood, but the impact is similar. So you can see what those 10 kind of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are on the diagram. You've got physical neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, witnessing violence against a parent, parental divorce or separation, a household member with substance abuse disorder, a household member with depression or mental illness, a household member in jail or prison, and emotional neglect. So they're not in any order, you know, none of them are deemed kind of more harmful than others. These are just the 10 adverse childhood experiences that they looked at in this particular study. And kind of, as you can see, you know, I think all of those were on our list at the beginning of kind of traumatic experiences or traumatic situations that might be really damaging for children. So it's consistent with what they've used in this study, which is why it's particularly helpful. So what researchers found as they followed participants over time is that a person's cumulative ACEs score, so how many ACEs they experienced in their childhood, is their score. So if a person experienced 4 of these experiences in their childhood, then their score would be 4. So the higher their score, essentially, the more numerous their health, social and behavioural problems were throughout their lifespan. So including significantly substance use disorders. So the more of these experiences that a person had in their first 18 years, the more likely they were to go on to develop a substance use disorder. Furthermore, problems related to these experiences tended to be kind of co-occurring. So they didn't find that they just led to substance abuse disorders, but they led to a combination of substance abuse disorders with criminality or poverty or health impacts. So lots of things co-occurring at the same time. I'm going to have a little bit of a break from talking now, and I'm going to hopefully, if it works, please let us know if it's not working on the chat and we can send the link. I'm hopefully going to share this video with you, which was put together, I believe, by Public Health Wales. Gives a really good overview of what ACEs are and how they might impact a person throughout their life. So it's about 5 minutes long, so hopefully not too long for you all, but I think it's really useful to watch. So I'm going to play that now for you.
Yeah.
So far, so good?
Yeah.
My parents don't understand. All the drinking and fighting means I'm scared. I'd like a cuddle, perhaps a bedtime story, but mostly I'd like them to stop shouting at me. And sometimes they hit me. Feeling scared every day and not feeling loved or wanted will change me for the rest of my life. Later, I'll have problems at school, problems with alcohol, and I'll get in trouble with the police. What's happening to me right now means I'm more likely to have serious health problems in middle age and die sooner than I should. Doctors say my life is full of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. But in my world, this means I see my dad hitting my mum. Dad's got a drinking problem, and mum's always crying, even with the tablets. I'm always being shouted at and hit. After the booze and fags, there's not a lot of money for toys or clothes, or even food. I'm getting used to being scared all the time. Now I'm just angry. Doctors say things are changing inside me. My brain isn't learning how to control my feelings properly. My body can't relax like those kids who don't have ACEs, so my body won't be able to repair itself properly when I get older, making it more likely I'll get cancer or heart disease as an adult. It hurts when my parents hit me, but the real damage is hidden, and that damage will be with me for life.
I drink and smoke. They say I'm out of control, but I'm not. It's just my way of coping with my ACEs. I've been in plenty of fights, but what's wrong with that? Kids' punches don't hurt half as much as when my dad hits me. I beat up a kid last week at school because he looked at me weird. Who cares? I ended up with more time out of school. Learning's not for me anyway, and the teachers don't care any more than my parents. I don't like the way anyone looks at me except my girl. She's 16 and pregnant, just like my mum was with me.
So this is where I've ended up. I've got diabetes and cancer's probably on the way. I know these kill you, but I couldn't do without them. I've never had a proper job and I've spent time inside. I hate my kids. I hate their mum too, until she left, so my kids have grown up with ACEs. And now my daughter had her first kid. She's 16. The course of my life was set in the wrong direction a long time ago. I know where I'm heading, and sadly I know where my kids are heading too. This doesn't have to happen. A little help in childhood makes a big difference to where life takes you. When I was a baby, the nurses noticed that my mum wasn't coping and helped her and explained how important my childhood is to the rest of my life. So, with a bit of help, she coped. The police came round after next door complained about the noise from mum and dad fighting. They asked how I was feeling. I told them I was scared all the time. Mum and dad got help. The shouting got better and the hitting stopped. I even got some bedtime stories. I still had problems at school, but the teacher asked me about what was happening at home. I got help controlling my feelings. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. I'm now married with 2 children, and I've got a job, most of the time. I haven't repeated the same problems with my kids. We got help when being a parent got too much. Our children are ACE-free, and that means their kids stand a good chance of growing up ACE-free as well. Almost half the people in England and Wales experienced one ACE as a child, and 1 in 10 of us suffered 4 or more ACEs. If we stop ACEs, millions of children would not become smokers or binge drinkers, and levels of violence in adults would. Fewer ACEs in childhood also means fewer adults developing diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes in middle age. We all need to be ACE aware. Are you? Doctors, police, nurses, teachers, firefighters, and most importantly, parents. The more you know about ACEs, the more you can help stop children growing up with ACEs in their lives. And for those of you who have already suffered ACEs, the more you know, the more you can help yourself. and others who have suffered ACEs cope.
Helen,
All right, yeah.
Somebody has asked if we could possibly link the video in the chat at some point. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that. Yeah, no problem. Hopefully everybody was able to watch that all the way through and hear it all the way through, most importantly. So we won't spend too long thinking about it, but the important thing is that it was looking all a bit bleak there in the middle there, wasn't it, when it looked like he died. You know, the dramatic kind of heartbeat went across the screen. It was all looking a little bit bleak and almost as though there's nothing you could do. Children's paths are set and that's the way they're going to end up, and there's nothing you can do and there's nothing any of us can do. And I think that's quite a bleak message for anyone working in kind of education or early years, isn't it? Because we like to think that we can make a difference. So actually it's nice and reassuring when we go on to see the kind of final chapter where actually he, you know, has managed to turn his life around, and that is, you know, due to some small things that happened in his childhood, some key people who helped the family and put things in place to support them, and as a result he was able to turn his life around and kind of raise his children in a way where they wouldn't experience the same things that he experienced. So that's the really key thing that we need to take away from this Adverse Child Experiences work. You know, yes, we need to support families in a kind of social care aspect so that, you know, less ACEs take place in the first place. But in terms of an educational aspect, when children come to you, if they've already experienced those ACEs, it's not a case of there's nothing we can do. You know, there are lots of things that you can do. So the study went on. Try and skip to the next slide. There we go. The study went on to look at what they've called PACEs, so protective and compensatory experiences. They like a good acronym. But these are experiences in childhood that act as buffers or insulators against that trauma and promote healing. So some of the things he talked about in the video was a nurse that helped them, a police officer that helped them, a teacher that helped them, things like that. So certainly people are really, really important in this, but there are some other things as well that are important and can act as a buffer against these experiences. And they found that a person with an ACE score of 4, so that is somebody who's had 4 of those adverse experiences in their childhood, who had no protective factors, no PACEs, may have a very different outcome than someone with the same score, the same number of adverse experiences, but who had a loving grandmother, teacher or coach, for example. So it's a really significant message to take away, because actually what it's saying is that you, as the child's teacher, key worker, whatever your role is in their life, you could be that difference for that child, and that's really, really significant, I think. So the most prominent PACE that they found, protective factor, is the unconditional love of a parent or mentor. So this is mentor, excuse me. So this is what I was talking about before, which is why attachment is so significant. So if a child has kind of experienced some of these ACEs, but they have that unconditional love of a parent, they have that secure attachment, then that's going to protect them from some of the impact of that. If they don't have that, then that's where the kind of mentor role comes in, and that could be anyone who cares about that child, anyone who wants to help and shows that child unconditional love, and that can make a difference for them. Some of the other things that they found to protect children against the traumatic experiences are having at least one best friend. This is why kind of relationships are so important, and supporting children to develop those personal and social skills in early childhood so they can go on to develop real friendships, because that can be a real protective factor. Mindfulness, hugely, hugely important for children to be able to develop coping strategies, strategies to calm themselves in stressful situations, and we're going to be looking at some of those later on. Exercise or physical activity is hugely protective, having kind of hobbies or clubs that they take part in, and a school that provided resources. So you know, this is equally as important for earlier settings. An earlier setting or a school that, you know, understands this and is able to provide support to that child can be a hugely protective factor. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's lots we can do when children have experienced this kind of trauma, and we're going to look at some kind of practical strategies relevant to the early years in a little while. Okay, so this was where we finished up, just looking at those kind of PACEs, those protective factors, the difference that we can make. So we've looked at how those negative experiences or those traumatic experiences are going to affect physical brain development. We've looked at how that those toxic levels of stress might, present in young children, all those difficulties they might have, all those problems they might develop. We've looked at how this can be kind of worsened or impacted or made more difficult by having an insecure attachment to your primary caregiver. And then we looked at ACEs and how those adverse experiences can affect children, not just during their childhood, but right, throughout their lives, really, and what the difference can be for them. So we're going to hone in on what you're all doing day to day. So in the early years, what this looks like, what children, when you have children that come to you, what they present like. You may know children who might come to you, you may know or have a strong feeling that they've experienced trauma in their early years, particularly if they are, for example, looked after. So if they're in care, there's a high chance they've experienced some of those traumatic experiences. If they had been in care and they've now been adopted, that's brilliant, but there's still a high chance they may have experienced some traumatic things. You may know some of those, that they've had some of those experiences in their lives when they come to you, or you might not. You may have children that come to you and you don't know whether they have or not, but some of the things you might see, might make you suspect that they have. So behaviours you might see in a setting, so things like a lack of appetite or eating more than usual, frequent stomach aches, frequent fatigue, diarrhea or constipation, sensitivity to sudden or loud noises, a regression back to that infant behaviour, so things like thumb sucking when you wouldn't expect a child of that age to be doing that, a lack of interest in kind of favourite toys or activities, and how it impacts relationships. So you might find that children are confused or forgetful, easily distracted, they have particularly intense feelings, or they could be withdrawn, fearful, poor listening and attention skills, difficulty displaying empathy or compassion for other children, feelings of shame, particularly either when they're praised or when they might be pulled up on undesirable behaviour. They might go into kind of a shame response, or anhedonia, which is the children unable to feel joy or happiness in a situation that you would usually expect children to find joyful. So some of these things on their own, not much of a big deal. They might be things that you see quite frequently in children, stomach aches and things. They're not going to be kind of causes for concern. But when you're seeing lots of these things, for a long period of time, that's when you might start becoming significantly concerned. And one explanation for these things could be, a child that is currently under a great deal of stress at home or has previously experienced some trauma or high levels of stress in their early years. So it's worth bearing in mind, looking out for these things if you know that a child has experienced these traumas, or likewise if you see these things co-occurring for a long period of time and you are becoming concerned, then it's worth thinking about what could be or could have been going on in the home environment for that child. So looking more positively about what we can do, one of the main things we can do as kind of care providers, education providers, is support children to develop coping skills and coping mechanisms and support them to manage their emotions, because this is something that may not come easily to them because of the structure of their brain, and we've looked at that. It's something they may not have had modelled to them if they haven't had that secure attachment relationship. They may not have had these kinds of things modelled to them, so they may not, know about them, and they may have a kind of heightened stress response or fight or flight response. And these kinds of coping skills are going to be, all the more important to support them to kind of manage those emotions and recognise those emotions and deal with them going forward. And if you can teach children coping skills really early in life, they are things that will stay with them. And lots of the skills that we teach children are actually, really relevant as an adult or as a teenager or as an adult, you know, in everyday life. They're nothing different. That it's just the way that we present them to children that's going to be slightly different. So, you know, if children can learn these skills in the early years, then I feel like they would stay with them for life, and they will always be, you know, a useful tool in their kit, so to speak, and they can draw on them time and time again. So we're going to be looking at what a few of those kind of skills are that we can teach children and how we can go about that. But some of the things that can be coping skills are kind of enjoyable activities, so reading, artwork, those kinds of feelings, playing games, yoga. Then there's more kind of specific things that they can turn to when they really need them, if there's a moment of overwhelm. So things like breathing exercises, positive self-talk. Supporting children to kind of recognise and label their feelings is hugely important, and I know a lot of you will do that as part of your PSED curriculum. So that's hugely important. And I think what's important to say as well is that, you know, teaching these skills, it doesn't have to be specific to those children who you know or suspect have experienced trauma. You know, these skills are going to be useful for all of us in any given situation. So it's something that can be done with as a whole group activity. They're not going to be, you know, not useful to anyone. They're going to be universally useful and kind of adaptive for children. So some of the kind of specific strategies we're going to briefly look at in the last few minutes of the webinar is something called the Lego emotions game, or you might have heard of it as the Skittles or M&M emotions game, but I couldn't possibly promote, you know, using sweets in earlier settings. You might have a riot on your hands. So it's just adapted here to use Lego. There's deep breathing activities, the significance of the adult role and how you can support interactions. So some strategies that you may be familiar with in terms of promoting communication can also be really adaptive in terms of promoting relationships and co-regulation as well. So this is the Lego emotions game. So like I said, I've traditionally seen this done with Skittles, M&Ms, anything that there's a lot of colours really, I suppose it works. I've adapted it today so it's with Lego, so it's a bit more early years setting friendly, I suppose. And you're not, you know, cracking out a big bag of M&Ms every time you want to learn about emotions. But essentially the idea is to play this game either one-on-one with a child, or you can do it as a small group depending on the kind of age and stage of the child that you're working with. But you have a bag of Lego bricks of all different colours, and you can model it for them, and then they can kind of copy. And it's about choosing a Lego brick, and for each colour there's a different emotion that you want the child to share with you. So one thing that makes you happy or sad or angry, excited, afraid. So you know, depending on the child's understanding, you can kind of differentiate this and just have a couple of coloured bricks in the bag and just choose happy and sad, you know, and younger children or children with kind of lower language levels might be able to just share those things, and then you can kind of add to it and make it more complicated as children's understanding develops and their kind of ability to recognise and name emotions and kind of name things that make them feel those emotions develops. And it's just a really kind of fun, low pressure way of supporting children to recognise those emotions. So deep breathing activities. So deep breathing is hugely important for children, and I don't think it's talked about enough really. It has massive, well, not just for children, for everybody, it has massive kind of physiological effects. So it really works to kind of physically calm you down when you're experiencing all of those physical effects of stress and anxiety. So the heightened heart rate and the stomach ache and feeling sick and all those trembles, things that you might get. Deep breathing helps to support that, floods your body with oxygen, floods your brain with oxygen, which supports the kind of rational decision making, supports you to be able to make a better decision. So it has so many uses, and it's just one of those tools that, you know, it's so simple, but we just forget to do when we're in those moments. So if we can teach children to have this as a go-to and have this as something that they do when they're feeling that way, it can be really, really, you know, really helpful for them. So one way of doing it is just to use a picture like this. This is a fairly grey and bland one, but you can find some exciting ones on the internet if you kind of have a little search. But a moving image that moves with the breath can really help children to kind of visualise that breath and make sure it's kind of deep enough and slow enough to have the desired effect. And other ways you can do it is through kind of imagery to help young children imagine the breath. So triangle breathing is very similar to the shape I just showed, but it's tracing a shape with your finger and breathing in as you trace the first side, holding your breath as you trace the second side, and breathing out as you trace the final side of the triangle. So it gives them a physical thing to do while they're breathing as well with their finger. So putting a big triangle up on the wall or even on the floor, and they can walk around it or trace it with their finger, or even, you know, run a toy car around it as they're breathing, depending on what their interest might be. Breathing using your imagination, and there are loads of these examples, so I've just put a couple here. Breathing in like a flower, breathing out like you're blowing out birthday candles. Breathe in the blue sky, breathe out the grey sky. Pretend your belly is like a balloon, so you breathe in to make the balloon bigger and breathe out to make the balloon shrink. Smelling the hot chocolate and cooling the hot chocolate with your breath is quite a nice one to visualise in the winter when it's cold, or if you're doing some kind of role play activities or anything like that, then you can kind of incorporate that. So really, whatever it is that the child is motivated by or interested in, you can link breathing exercises to that using their imagination. The animal ones are quite nice as well, so I've just put a couple of those on there. So the snake breath, you can imagine is breathing in, and then as you breathe out you hiss like a snake. Or the bumblebee one, exactly the same, but as you breathe in you're smelling a flower, and as you breathe out you buzzing like a bee. So they're all just ways to engage children in deep breathing and help them kind of slow their breath down and visualize that breath. So just a final quote from you here before we look at a couple of other bits. So it is clear from the beginning that children have a driving motivation to become part of a meaningful world. They want to share interests, purposes and actions. Children need company which is interested and curious and affectionate. So we talk about this kind of time and time again in training, and I know that the early years advisors who are with us today will kind of empathise with this because it's something that they talk about again and again and again, and that is the fact that the adult role is so significant, and the best tool you have at your disposal when working with young children is yourself and your interactions with them. And that's, you know, so true of this particular area of working with children who have experienced trauma or have attachment difficulties, because your role in that is extremely significant. So I've revisited some strategies which are, I think, well known in early years, but potentially for kind of a slightly different purpose. And these are more kind of strategies used to promote speech and language, maybe in children who have language delay or difficulties with their language development. So one of these is the observe, wait, listen rule, or OWL. And this is used to support children's language development, really, to observe what they're interested in, wait and give them time to respond, and listen to what they have to say. But I think it's equally as important in children's kind of emotional development and sense of self and sense of well-being, and in terms of developing those relationships that you have with the children in your setting. Because observing them, waiting, giving them time and listening to what they have to say supports children to feel important and feel heard. So I was researching this strategy, and one of the promoters of it, I suppose, said she asked people how they know when someone is listening to you, and the answers include: they wait for me to finish talking, they don't just tell me what to do, they look at me as if they're interested. So they can be kind of morphed into these kind of practical strategies of observe, wait and listen to show children that they're an important part of the conversation. By observing the child, paying close attention to what they say and do. Sometimes children will initiate their efforts to communicate through actions, gestures, and sometimes through words. And sometimes they might simply start doing something or start an activity. And it tells you what the child is really interested in. So by observing, we learn a huge amount about children. So waiting gives the children to show their interest in something. It gives them it allows them to take charge of the interaction, and it lets the child know, I think you're important and I'm interested in what you have to say. And listening, the final part, is really, really essential. So rather than always thinking about what to say next, listening to what the child actually says, or what their actions are telling you, and responding appropriately. So by kind of listening and responding in an appropriate way, you're letting the child know that they're genuinely important, that you're genuinely focused on them, and it makes the child feel powerful and validated. So they can be hugely impactful feelings for a child who might otherwise be feeling some of the negative things that we looked at earlier on. To feel important and heard and validated can be hugely powerful. Another of the strategies I thought about, which is generally promoted for language, to promote language in earlier settings, is communication-friendly spaces. And some of you might have heard about this or done some training around this. And it's looking at making your environment or spaces within your environment really friendly for communication. So really cozy, really comforting, lots of natural resources to make children feel as comfortable as possible to communicate when they might find this difficult, and to give children lots of things to talk about as well. So I think, again, that's really hugely important to consider when working with children who've experienced trauma in their lives. I think creating spaces where they feel comfortable and safe is hugely important. And if a child feels able to kind of open up and communicate with you, then that's a good indication that they're feeling that way, and it's going to promote that relationship as well. So really nice cozy spaces to work one-on-one with a child, or to work in a small group where they're not feeling quite so open and overwhelmed by the size of the setting. It could be a cozy corner or a cozy den or something. Kind of completing some of the activities and doing some of the work, such as the deep breathing exercises and things in these kind of cozy spaces, are going to really help the children to feel safe and grounded and secure. So it's a really nice strategy. So if you don't know much about communication friendly spaces already, I definitely suggest looking into it. Elizabeth Jarman is the lady who kind of founded the theory, and think of it in terms of supporting those children with their emotional development and their well-being, as well as promoting their language development, because I think it can be beneficial for both. So the final kind of strategy I'd wanted to talk about is co-regulation. So co-regulation is yourself as a practitioner working with the child to regulate your own behaviour, and in turn their behaviour, their feelings, their mood, keeping them very calm and regulated, so they're able to then learn to self-regulate eventually. But before they can self-regulate, they need to co-regulate with an adult. And significantly, you know, these children may not have had this experience within the home. They may not have had a parent who could co-regulate with them for whatever reason. So how to co-regulate: provide warm, responsive relationship, structure the environment, so that could be where the communication friendly spaces comes into things, and teach or coach self-regulation skills. So, you know, they can be as simple as the deep breathing exercises we talked about. They can be as simple as naming your emotions, naming something that made you feel a certain emotion. Doing something like the Lego emotions game, for example, is all going to teach children self-regulation skills. And remember, at this age, you know, in the early years, any skills we teach them, you know, need to be really, really simple for them to be able to replicate on their own. And it's not something that you do once and then expect a child to be able to self-regulate. Obviously, this needs to be something that we do really, really regularly with children so that they learn these skills. So important to recognise yourself as a co-regulation partner in this. Pay attention to your own feelings during stressful interactions with a child. So make sure that you remain grounded. Pay attention to your own thoughts and beliefs about the behaviour of others, and use strategies to self-calm so that you can respond effectively and compassionately. So, for example, caregivers greatly benefit from taking a moment for deep breaths and self-talk. And when a caregiver responds calmly to a child, it helps keep the child's feelings from escalating, and also models regulation skills. Now, I know that sounds really obvious, that actually if you're going to co-regulate, you need to be calm yourself. But it's something that in the moment, especially if you're presented with a very anxious child or a child whose behaviour can be really challenging. It is quite difficult to remember that. And what is so important about all of this is that supervision and support in the workplace is extremely important. If you're working with a child who you know has experienced trauma or you suspect has experienced trauma, that can be really, really challenging, and the impact of that, the way the child presents, can be really, really challenging as well. So having really good support and good supervision in the workplace with a colleague, a peer, or with a manager is hugely important. Okay, finally, we're nearly at the end. I just want to make a few links to the Early Years Foundation stage and Development Matters, just so this can link in with your curriculum and your practice and your observations and things. So it links in really, really nicely, and you'll see that. So just looking at the overarching principles of the EYFS, they talk about a unique child who has unique experiences. So nothing is more unique than having an experience of trauma in your life. Everybody's, experiences of that are going to be individual to what they actually experienced and how it made them feel and what age they were when they experienced it and all of these things. So hugely unique to that child. Positive relationships. I don't think I need to say anymore. We've talked again and again about positive relationships and the difference they make. Enabling environments. So again, looking at the space you have, looking at the space you want to use if you want to do any of this work with children, and how the environment might be able to support that. And significantly, that children learn and develop in different ways and at different rates. And that's hugely important when considering working with children who have had trauma in their lives, because actually children cannot learn unless they feel safe. And it is going to be far more difficult for children who have experienced trauma to feel safe, but they can. And everything you do in your setting, the environment you create, the relationships you develop are going to be supporting them to feel safe so that they can start to learn. And then I've just linked it to the prime areas. So obviously it links really well with personal, social, and emotional development, developing a positive sense of self, developing positive relationships, supporting children to manage their feelings. Also fits really well in with communication and language, because we're supporting children to develop their confidence and its skills in expressing themselves, and links in with physical development as well. We want children to be active and interactive and to develop their independent skills. And we did look a lot about the physiological impact of trauma and how that can potentially kind of damage their physical skills or their independent skills, or delay them even. So there really is a physical side to it all that needs to be considered and supported, and things like the deep breathing can really help that physical aspect. And the characteristics of effective learning, those things can only be present when a child feels safe. And like I said, that all of these things that we can do in our settings for children are going to support them to feel safe if they don't otherwise feel that way, or if it's more challenging for them to feel that way. We've got to the end of my content just in time, but I just wanted to give you just somewhere you could go if you were interested in children's mental health or children who have experienced trauma. If you're interested a little bit more in that, a really, really great place to start is the Anna Freud Centre, which is a physical centre in London, but they have a really strong online offer with lots of information and training. And they have something online called Early Years in Mind, which is a free, you'll be pleased to hear, online network for early years practitioners. It gives lots of guidance, supporting material, training and things like that. And it was developed by mental health experts. And really importantly, it's about the mental health of babies, young children and their families. So it really focuses in on that early years. I find a lot of the information about children's mental health is focused around secondary or even later primary, but there's not a great deal of information and support around the early years. So this is a really great kind of specific resource around the early years that I would definitely recommend you check out. And that is the end, just in time, as I said.